Hey, welcome to another episode of MainUNStream, and I'm joined once again on the mic by Associate Professor Simon Michaux out of Finland. Simon, how are you, mate? Welcome.
G'day, Paul. How you doing?
Very well, my friend, and great to have you back on the mic. Today we're going to actually start a series. Everyone who's, if you haven't seen the stuff from Simon before, I highly recommend you check out. I think it's episode 4 and episode 8. Where we talked about the lack of global resources, and specifically with regard to the renewable energy sector, and that's a really interesting one. And we also cover off on the convenient omission and the inconvenient truth. And I think it was episode 8 where we talked about the fragility of the financial system.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and there was a lot. Simon has a lot of data which he shares in those episodes, and I highly recommend you go and check them out. But today we're going to start off with number 1 of a small short series of episodes which are focused around money and power and influence, because we want to look at what is happening now by looking at what's happened in the past and make some connections for people. So if you want to know more about Simon, I'm going to be sharing some links in wherever you're seeing this, on YouTube, on Rumble, if we're still on YouTube, that is. one of our shows got temporarily censored on YouTube. Simon knows. So Rumble, brand YouTube, BitChute, whatever. Okay, so wherever you see that, we'll be sharing a link to find out more about Simon and how you can engage with him, and get him to come and talk to your people about any of these and other topics where he is expert in. Mate, I wanted to start off today. We've got a few topics I wanted to cover, and I wanted to start off today maybe with the nature of money. Where does where does money come from, and what is money? Because I don't believe that everybody really gets what money is.
Yeah.
Quite apart. So everyone knows the folding stuff and the coins, and even if they pay digitally, they electronically with their Ep20 pass or their debit card, credit card, they still think in terms of banknotes and coins, and that's cash.
Yeah. So you got money and currency, and money is like a medium of exchange. It's like a decision system of who owns what and who gets what, right?
Yep.
It's we could be marooned on an island and we could use bottle caps instead. Yeah. But my understanding of this is back in the day, before they actually had minted coins, everyone just went to the market and exchanged like this cartload of carrots for that cartload of potatoes, and so it was a barter system.
Yep.
And so money became like a central point where we had everything could be exchanged for a portion of this thing we called money, and so it became much easier for commerce to happen.
It allowed us to break out the villages and go beyond our borders.
Yeah, and then we got to the point where if you had like large amounts of money being carried around long distances, you were subject to raids. Like my ancestors were in the Dutch VOC company, which is the first transnational, and this is like back in 1740 or around there. And there you've got there you've got instead of gold coins, so where the coin itself had gold in it, it was just minted out of copper, and so the VOC coins themselves were relatively worthless. Right, but what it meant was they couldn't be sort of targeted by pirates anymore. Right, so then you had this system set up by the Knights Templars, where they actually you could have an arrangement with noble houses over a long period of time, where they'd write a promissory note and they'd give it to a trader, and this is go to this house at the other end of Christendom and give it to this particular house, and then they will give you X amount of coins. right? And so you had the idea as a piece of paper was worth money, and so then you had the idea of, instead of a coin, you had a piece of paper, and in the paper you had like a strip of metal, there was supposed to be like a strip of silver in a pound sterling.
Right.
Right. And the US dollar was redeemable for precious metals at one stage. But then when the formation of the Federal Reserve, that all changed.
Yeah,
And
so maybe that might be a good place to go, actually. What do you think? Because so you have cash, which is the folding stuff and the clinking stuff. You have money, which is a medium of exchange. You have currency, which is a system for a medium of exchange. And then you have what's called fiat currency. And it's got nothing to do with the automobile. It's got a fiat currency is a system for a medium of exchange by declaration or proclamation. So in other words, a government or any other body which has authority comes together and says, okay, we are going to declare that within our realm, this is the system for the medium of exchange. Thus, the Australian dollar, the euro, prior to the euro, the Dutch guilder, the Italian lira, the US, and then in the US, the US dollar, and so forth. That is fiat currency. But what I believe a lot of people don't understand is that, with the exception of maybe 3 countries, there are every country in the world doesn't own its own money.
Not anymore.
It doesn't own its own currency anymore.
Yeah, not anymore.
Not anymore. And the company, the currency, is owned by a company. Now, for everyone who's about to throw a tinfoil hat label at this, don't bother. It's very simple. There is a thing called a central bank. Yeah.
Correct.
And in America, it's called the Federal Reserve. In Australia, it's called the Reserve Bank. In Europe, it's called the European Central Bank. And before that, they had all the various European countries had their own central banks. But the reason I thought it might be interesting for us to go into the Federal Reserve, specifically in the context of money, power, and influence, would be to look at why was the Federal Reserve even created? Right? Yeah. Because I think this is something the majority of people, I believe, will not be aware of. And again, you don't need to. We're not trying to convince you of anything. Go out and do the research yourself. Just take the information and figure it and find it out. The information's out there.
So and the other one was fractional reserve banking.
Yeah,
where there was a time when you had like a pile of cash, and some of that cash was then given to some people, and they went off and did something with it called a business, and that made some more cash, and they brought it back. Right? Okay, all right, sounds all right. But this part where fractional reserve banking, where 90% of it can be loaned out, right, without actually sort of keeping those reserves, and they use that is now it's just numbers on a screen. Right? They don't even bother printing stuff anymore. It's numbers on a screen, and so money is created out of thin air.
Yep.
When you go to a bank now and you get a loan to, say, buy a house, they don't give you a truckload of cash. They put some numbers into an account they make, and those numbers are drawn from an account that they have, but those numbers are allowed to expand. Right, so at that point, they are literally creating numbers out of thin air, and that's called money, the expansion of the money system. And according to the rules, that's fine. And everyone thinks as if it's fine. It's the way it's always been, But we're in a hyperinflationary curve now. But it's taking a long time. An exponential curve takes a long time to get to the hockey stick part.
Yep. I'm going to say I'm glad you mentioned fractional reserve banking, because it is the one of the root causes of many evils in the banking system.
Can you imagine the pitch meeting? You imagine the guys who sat down and said, "Sorry, how are we going to convince them to do this? We're going to get them to sign us, private individuals, the authority to create their money, and they lose control." I suppose at the time, banking had become so esoteric that most people just didn't understand it. And those that did understand it were so hopelessly dependent on that system being successful that they couldn't say anything. You know, Woodrow Wilson, when he actually finally signed the Federal Reserve Act, he later wrote in his diaries how much he regretted what he had done. There were many attempts to actually get the Federal Reserve Act up and running. There were several. There was several attempts on U.S. presidents in terms of assassination attempts. Andrew Jackson, for example, was subject to an assassination attempt. Anyway, so
hey, you're absolutely right. I mean, and by the way, let me just add. By the way, I know we're focusing on the Federal Reserve in terms of being a central bank.
Yeah,
and yes. It's probably because it's the it's one of the more modern ones. It's the probably documented histories around, because central banks existed in Europe before this, and indeed when I think it was Aldrich was the guy's name, when he and his companions, his cohorts were investigating this whole thing of how to create a central bank. They were off in Europe spending hundreds of thousands of U.S. taxpayer dollars looking at central banking and understanding how it worked. Now, hundreds of thousands doesn't sound like a lot of money these days, but at the turn of the century, 1900, it's a hell of a lot.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And the fractional reserve banking is part of what created the crises to create the pretense to get the US to come along on a Federal Reserve system.
Yes, there was the 1907 panic and there was the 1905 panic.
I
think 1905?
Yeah,
there's a couple of them.
Yeah, and if you go back to, I mean, and very well respected names, J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan, right? J.P. Morgan at the center of this whole thing in the late 1800s. Now, before the central bank, before the Federal Reserve, I know you know this, but a lot of people listening won't. Before the Federal Reserve, J.P. Morgan either controlled directly or through influence controlled a great number of the banks. And he would issue memorandums to the bank directors saying, telling them what to do, creating crises after crises after crises. For example, these days you have central bank creating monetary policy and money and monetary and distribution of money throughout the economy. But back then it was unregulated. So he would tell his banks to withdraw, for example, when one of the memorandums, withdraw a third of your existing currency from circulation and call half your loans. And when you do that, what happens?
Yeah, bank run.
Yeah. You create a shortage. Yeah, I mean, and the fact you mentioned the fractional reserve banking, a lot of people maybe don't understand, because you mentioned you touched on that with the 90%. Just in case anyone hasn't watched this, there's loads of videos out there about this, and indeed watch episode 8, I think it was, where Simon explains it so well. If the bank has no money today, and you put $1 million in the bank, your client number one. You put $1 million in the bank, that bank can lend $900,000 out. And that bank lends $900,000 to John, who goes and pays Jim for services, and Jim goes and puts his $900,000 in the bank. And the bank says, whoopee, I've got another $900,000. No, they don't, but yes, they do, because it's on a different account.
Yeah.
And now I go and lend out $810,000 to Steve, and Steve goes and pays Andy $810,000 for products and services. And Andy says, I'm going to put my $810,000 in the bank. The bank says, whoopee, I've got another $810,000. No, you don't. What do they do? There's another account. And
one of the things that people have trouble understanding that is they say, but everyone uses different banks. Right, we're talking about different banks here. But the banking system mathematically can be modeled as one entity, and also financial in terms of ownership, like who owns these banks.
Yep.
You look at who, in terms of shareholders and executive shareholders, is all banks are actually owned by someone else. When you look at who those someone else is, you go back, say, 2 and 3 levels of complexity of ownership, and you find that most banks are actually connected. Like the Australian banking system is heavily owned by the American banking system, in particular the Bank of America. Right, and that's not advertised. That's not that well understood. But so when you sort of say like, oh, but they're separate banks, and so well, not really, but also in terms of the amount of money in circulation, you had $1 million to start with, but now all of a sudden you've got 10 million. Like, where the hell did that come from? Well, 9,990,000. You know, it's just below 10 times. And so you think, well, I don't get it. And it's so abstract that the mind is repelled.
Yeah.
You just can't. Nah, it's not possible.
People need to think about banks a bit like Coca-Cola. You have the Coca-Cola division, you have the Sprite division, you have the Fanta division, you have the whatever the mineral water division is, Bombita, whatever it is.
Yep.
And each of them have their own budgetary responsibility and their own financials.
And they're in competition with each other, honest.
They are. They certainly are. Right? They're all trying to sell each other, outsell each other. But they all belong to the one company. So you can think a bit more abstractly, you'll get this really, really easily. So who controls money is not, it doesn't matter where you live, unless you live in North Korea or Cuba or Iran, I think is the last one.
Iran's the last one.
Right. Yeah. And if you live in those three countries, cool, you got no central bank. And actually, Russia has recently kicked the Rothschilds out, I believe you've said.
Yes, they've paid off the debt owed to the central banks of the world associated with World War II. It was a major debt that they've paid that off now. I think it was 2018. So all debt they now hold is with relatively modern actions. Right, and they're no longer beholden to the international banking cartel. Right.
So they own their own currencies. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if I go that far.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but they're not beholden in this. They're not beholden the same way, say, Greece is beholden. So
Greece is just bending over like Greeks do. So no offense to the Greeks, but
they were also put in a position where by the time it's like a chess match. By the time the Greek people actually understood what was happening, they're screwed. Anyway, like what option did they have? When they joined the European Union, all their gold reserves for the drachma was given to the European Union, and so it was all given away. They had nothing to actually start there. And so while the people on the ground started to understand, they didn't understand the true difficulties that were faced with them and what was required of them. And so at the last minute, they all blinked because they didn't understand. And frankly, I challenge you to find a group of people in the Western world who do any different.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it's a good point to bring up the Greeks right now. You know why? Because what people, I believe, around the world need to learn the lesson from what happened in Greece when trust was lost in the financial system. You know, like trust in the financial system. I've said it many times. Trust in politics and in government and politics and the financial system is just another form of Stockholm syndrome. But what happened when the Greeks lost trust in the financial system is the exact same thing that happened in the Great Depression. We'll come back to that because that was another issue with regard to central banks. They made a run on the banks. And what the government did is it wasn't the banks who did it. The government stopped the run on the banks. They stopped payments through the ATMs or through the banks. And so the reason I mentioned that is with regard to the current obvious push. It's been going for a while, but the obvious push to cashless society. And one of the key elements of a cashless society is there is not, because remember, cash is the fold. Like Simon, you know this. Cash is the folding and the chinking stuff.
Yeah,
right. It's not money; it's just folding. So when there's a cashless society, there can be no run on the bank because no one needs to get cash out. If anyone loses faith in the financial system and they say, "Oh, we don't trust you anymore. Give me my money."
Yeah.
The government and the bank say, "Well, hey, you've got your app on your smartphone. Yeah. Is your money there? Yeah. What's your problem?"
Well, what's coming behind that is that app just crashes.
Yeah, totally.
It doesn't work anymore. Oh, look at that. So what's interesting is here in Finland, they're not quite a cashless society, but for about we very rarely handle cash. The only reason we handle cash is to get cash out at an ATM to pay my daughter pocket money. That's it. That's it. And now we're not even doing that. We're just buying a DS games for a little computer DS or computer games.
Right.
That's the currency now.
Yeah.
Right.
And how many people have these debit cards for their kids? They just put the money on them.
Everyone, and we're actually considering doing that now because it's easier. The whole society is geared for that. And what people don't understand, it is more convenient now. All this technology stuff is actually better and more convenient for humanity as long as the people in charge are there for our best interests. Right? But when they're not there for our best interests, where we're going, I believe, is into an era of there's not enough to go around for one reason or another. Right? And so how does a large number of people get held in place by a small number of people to accept crushing poverty and food shortages? Right? Especially when it becomes apparent that none of this needed to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So the only thing to say that these things are controlled. People say, "Oh, well, what for?" These issues are rolling in now.
Yeah.
So yes.
You got an opinion on that? Because otherwise, I'm going to head on into. I was going to just say. No, go on.
Yeah. What do you mean? Opinion on what?
Why cashless society, that sort of stuff. But we'll come back to that. I was going to say
it's a control mechanism that allows the people at the top of the food chain to maintain absolute control through a crisis. So they maintain a situation where on the other side of the crisis they stay in control.
Yeah, and the best crisis is one that you manufacture so that you can predict what's going to happen. Yeah, and I know a lot of people. Sorry, go on.
It's like controlling both sides of the chessboard. And a cashless society in an era of hyper surveillance where everything is surveilled, it is now openly recognized that we're in a surveillance society where all communications are captured and monitored and now openly censored on Facebook, and we've got people that we know are lining up to support that. In a cashless society where nothing is private, but we don't control anything at all, both sides of the chessboard are controlled, not by us.
Absolutely. And in the past, both sides of the chessboard used to be two different countries waging war, and the same bank would be financing both. These days, it's more lower level. What do you do? As a Joe blogs on the street, what do you do? Your money's on an account, it's on your smartphone, and suddenly the government says, or someone says, sorry, your money's been taken away, it's not there. Who do you complain to? How do you get your money back? The answer is going to be bloody tough, bloody hard, especially when you factor in things like the Chinese system, which is already in place, of social credit, which is going to be fully operational this year, maximum next year.
Sesame credit. Sesame credit, I think it's called. Yeah. Research if you haven't.
Sorry?
Research it if you haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I did a video on this one way back. It's got different names. Sesame credit, but social credit system was what they were calling it at the time. And as I posited in that video, what do you do when social credit system about, hey, how well do you behave in society, publicly and privately, right? In your office, in the library, in the shopping center, on public transport, on the phone, on your phone, on internet or whatever, and that determines how well your credit score goes. I mean, we have a fiscal credit score right now, which determines how well what sort of terms we get with a loan. Social credit system determines everything from, do we get to travel outside of our region? Do we get the best seats in the opera? Do we get what sort of rates do we get on hire cars? What sort of education institution do our children go to? Where are we allowed to apply for a place to live? What sort of place are we allowed to buy, if they're allowed to buy it in China?
And so on and so forth, yeah.
Yeah. And this exists. Go and Google it, right? But what do you do when the social credit system turns into a fiat social currency? So remember, money is a medium of exchange. Currency is a system for a medium of exchange, and fiat currency is a system for a medium of exchange by proclamation from, for example, a government. So what do you do when the social credit system turns into a social fiat currency or a fiat social currency? I'll just leave that question there because the other thing that people throw at me is cryptocurrency.
Yep.
Cryptocurrency is going to be our savior. No, it's not.
Yeah. The cryptocurrency it would have been okay if it was in a situation where it could be genuinely anonymous, right? But when you put all transactions up against the fact that everything we do, every transaction we make, every email we send, every phone call we make, and every purchase we make is all recorded, right? It's all recorded and it's all harvested and then shared. No privacy.
Yeah.
Right. So
Simon, it's encrypted. It's all encrypted and it's all blocked. I know, I'm teasing.
And then you go to the tax end of things, where every business that does business has got to, for tax purposes, explain where all money comes from. All money are there. And so once that is done in a blockchain kind of way, right, then there is a case of, they can reverse engineer what you spent your money on. Right. And so what comes with this is a degradation of human rights. We think we have human rights, but what's actually been happening for some time now is those rights have been eroding since about the late 1970s, but increasingly since the year 2001.
And I probably even, I personally, I go back a bit further, but yes,
but 2001 was a flashpoint where things started openly happening.
Absolutely, and anyone who thinks that anyone who believes this story about some vague character in a basement, with a Japanese sounding name, drinking Jolt Cola or eating pizza, most likely, like programmers back in the 80s, creating this code and then launching this fantastic cryptocurrency in their world, and it's just sort of being let go through, and it's so wonderful. You believe that? I've got a bridge you might want to buy, and it crosses the Hudson between Brooklyn and Manhattan. Many a man's trying to sell it.
Problem with that is the timing. It just happened to appear just as the 2008 GFC was happening.
Convenient.
And everyone was saying, "What the hell do we do to replace the dollar?"
And pretty convenient, right?
Yeah, and no one knows. And still to this day, there is no functioning plan. They're talking about the SDRs, strategic drawing rights, but that has been around for a long time too. It's it's been around the idea of a group global currency net. Problem is that SDR system is backed by US dollars and euros, right? So
or now euros, previously European currency, yeah.
So what you've got is a situation where it's a house of cards held together with chewing gum and positive thinking, and as long as everyone agrees and has confidence in it, it's okay. But now we've got to the point where to pay off our debts and service our economy, our debt to GDP ratio is now higher than 90%. So it is now expanding. So each year we go further into debt. And people say, "Oh, no, that's not possible." But actually, each year we have indeed gone further into debt. And now we're to the point where we're adding something like $1 trillion a year to the debt pile in the United States alone. But every central bank around the world is doing the same thing, right? So we're actually in a hyperinflationary spiral. Here's a good one for you. All US dollars in circulation at the moment, right? And when I saw this in July, 24.6% had been created in the year 2020, right? By November, I think it was November 10th or something like that, 35%. So it went from 24.6 to 35%, an extra 10% in a few weeks, right?
And that's thanks to a little process that we discussed in episode 8 called quantitative easing.
Yeah, and now, so that Federal Reserve now system is now responsible for keeping that afloat, and is now responsible for underwriting much of the United States real economy, because everyone is in lockdown at the moment. And if they were going to do the free market thing and let nature take its course, a lot of that would just go out of business and just fall to bits.
Yep.
And so, yeah, and so they've done the interventionist route, which does mean that society still holds together, and you don't have these really sort of devastating eras of poverty. But what it does mean, though, that the system itself is destroyed, and that poverty is still coming.
Yeah, it's just it's just delaying the poverty. And let's just pause for a moment, because there's a bunch of stuff that we've covered and it's maybe getting muddied for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Fractional reserve banking, 90% of what's in the bank, whatever comes back into the bank and back into the bank and back into the bank, can be lent out. And you can just go and run your own spreadsheet on how that works, and it basically doubles the amount of money doubles? No, it's 100% on top, the amount of money in flow. But how does money get into the system? Well, the central bank, a government, for example, comes along and says, well, we need some extra money. And central bank, they say, well, okay, we'll give you some money. We'll give you another $1 billion, or as is the case these days, the quantities are usually in the vicinity of $1 trillion. We'll give you another $1 trillion, and we'll charge you interest. And that, even if that's 1%, that $1 trillion is going to cost you $1,010 billion. So you're going to have to give us a promissory note. Remember what Simon talked about with regard to the Templars back in the day? They started with these pieces of paper, which were the predecessor of banknotes, but also then the predecessor of so-called treasury notes, really, because they're worthless. And the government issues this treasury note, 10 years, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, whatever the duration is. And it has an interest rate on it, maybe 1%, 0.5%, maybe 2%, whatever. Yeah. So the government promises to pay back the central bank $1 billion, and, for example, another $1 trillion and another $10 billion. So where's the $10 billion come from? So you might ask, because I say, oh, well, you're right, taxes, your taxes. But an interesting little thing for you to look up, and this happens around the world. It's the most documented one is the US. After the implementation of the Federal Reserve Act, we should actually get back to that, because that's a whole interesting story, right?
Mm.
But after the introduction of the Federal Reserve Act, where the central bank was now issuing this money, this money to the US government and expecting interest in return, the US government didn't have a mechanism for it. And so a few years later, the federal income tax law was implemented to cover the interest payments.
Yeah.
Let's just briefly go back to the Federal Reserve Act, because I think it's a great example of what's happening now. Maybe not so much what's happening now, but why it's happening now. And a lot of people are confused about this whole thing, as we're going to get to it shortly, called the Great Reset.
Yes.
A number of people I think who never heard of it, right? And they say, yeah, but how could this happen? And one thing I want to encourage people to do is understand that this alleged left and right of politics doesn't exist. It's a perception. There is no real left and right. There is total government model and there is minimal government model.
But they do different things, right? The different things of the same plan. They pass the ball back and forth from each other.
Yeah. Look at any government around the world. When there's a left-wing government, a so-called left-wing government in office, they move the country to the left.
Yeah.
When there's a right-wing government in office, you'd think that they move them back to the right, but they don't. What they do at best is they keep them going down the same path, and sometimes they move them to the left even further. Yeah. And they keep passing them, like I say, passing them back and forth. I mean, Nixon was a Republican, right? Right-wing, allegedly. And the Democrats of the days were like, we could never have passed as many liberal laws liberal for those Australians amongst us don't mean right wing, it's liberal. In America, there's left wing. We could never have passed as many liberal laws as Nixon passed. So why do I mention that? I know you're familiar with this, Simon. So, and you mentioned already with regard to the Federal Reserve Act, when it all culminated around the time of Taft, who was a Republican, so-called right wing, and Taft knocked this thing on the head again. And so Aldrich, I think it was Aldrich, right? He goes to Wilson. He's Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, with the same plan, the same legislation. And the banks who helped draft this whole thing, because they had a meeting on Jekyll Island, just off Georgia, prior to all this, to put the whole plan together. So the bankers get together with this guy Aldrich. They put this plan together for the Federal Reserve Act. Taft, a Republican, so-called right-wing president, knocks it on the head again, and they go to Wilson, a left-wing Democrat. But it's not enough. They have to stack the deck, and this is an example of what is happening now with regard to the so-called left and right of politics in the era of the Great Reset and COVIDianism. There's no difference, because what they did is they went and got Teddy Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. Right. So you have these interest groups that sit behind our politics. There was a time when democracy was real and elections meant something. And yes, there was a difference in the parties, and the parties were a check on each other. Yeah. Right. But now we've got a situation where it's like we've got one government but two acting troops. And it's like you've got a layer of civil service that is not elected, not really sort of seen, but even senior members of that civil service are drawn from the same pool of people, and they're not elected. And supposedly the elected officials tell them what to do, but actually the elected officials, the face changes, but the civil service does not. Right? The joke is it's the B team. We were here before you arrived, and we'll be here when you're gone.
Yeah.
So
it's like yes, minister.
Yeah. But in a deadly serious kind of way, they're not adhering to the public interest. They're actually adhering to the big end of town, the money end of town, and in fact, the actions of what nation states have been doing in the Anglosphere, United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, is better modeled in terms of what they do. Not what they say, what they do is modeled like a group of, it's like an oligarchy cartel, an organized crime cartel. Because the United States in particular has been operating with impunity that a lot of stuff they do is just not legal. Mm-hmm. We don't care. And even if both foreign and domestic. There's a lot of stuff that's gone down that is irrational, and you think, well, what's happening here? And the net result is a small number of people are protected and favored, and everyone else is drained. And so the wealth gap, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The current American politics, it must be apparent to all now that both sides of the aisle, are not. In terms of what they do at the end of the day, are seeing to the interests of the big money end of town. And even the people who claim to be there for the people, like AOC, for example, all the stuff that she sort of come up with that's been sort of quite disruptive and everything. But what she actually votes on is she votes with the party line. Right, and so things like Nancy Pelosi, after 50-odd years in public service, she wasn't rich when she went in, but she's now literally a millionaire, like a multi-millionaire. How does that happen? When they're not supposed to be making money on the side.
Clearly, they haven't been following Trump's practice of donating their salary.
Trump's an anomaly in multiple respects. And I think the way we've been presented what Trump actually is not correct. The mainstream media is actually part of those interest groups. and everyone wants to get back to the situation where they can just make more money. That's all they want to know about. And in private, they don't want the spotlight put on them. However, the world is changing. We've got our financial systems are now getting to the point where they're going to fragment to a million bits. Nothing can stop that. A credible case can be now made that peak oil was, in fact, November 2018. Right, and the oil industry is going to struggle mightily to get back to that level, and it's not that we've run out of oil; we've run out of money, and our oil reserves are depleting at 5 to 7% a year, underneath all the new drilling they're doing, and the new drilling's just stopped. Right, so there's that, and
but they keep printing money,
huh?
But they keep printing money.
Yeah, but they do. Just before COVID happened, 9 out of 10 the United States tight oil sector had become the new Saudi Arabia. They were the swing producer that protected the rest of the industry. Right? Now, just before COVID, in 2019, 9 out of 10 operators had a negative cash flow. And this is just before COVID. And then COVID happened, the price dropped, everyone stopped using oil, there was an oil glut. And a lot of them just went out of business, and for them to come back, the oil price has to be up around the $70 to $80 a barrel for them to consider restarting their businesses, and that can't happen because the society at large is now carrying so much debt. We can't sustain the growth, right? And so now you've got like between a rock and a hard place, and something's got to break. Right, so that's the energy problem. The money problem is we're now in a hyperinflationary spiral where, if we can have such a large proportion of the money system that was created just this year alone, right? Then,
35% you were saying, right?
35%, but that was in November. I don't know what it is now. You'd have to look it up, but what I would say is in 6 months' time, that number is probably going to be over 50 to 60%.
So, what a lot of people need to get is this: when you have this quantitative easing going on, like was it the China alone has printed $30 trillion or something in currency or in money, ones and zeros on a screen, and that goes into the banking system. Fractional reserve banking kicks in, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So the inflation is crazy. The debts will never be paid back. The governments will never be able to pay the debts back. What happens? So then along comes Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, and starts talking about, we need to reset capitalism. Yeah.
So I'm in Europe at the moment, and I often will sit in these. Well, I haven't been to one for a year or two now, but I used to go to Brussels regularly and sit in the European Commission meetings where they would not do any planning, but they would present to the H2020, which is like a big research platform. And Horizon 2020 is the next one, and where they've got to say this and they're talking about the development of what they call the smart city, where all information is collected on what we do and how, and it's put into one place and it's optimized to get the best optimization of all. And it's seen as this like a technological efficiency, but it's all based on the idea of the society is still growing. Right, we're having more people, more money come into the system, more resources. The whole system at large is growing, and there's just a way of just optimizing the efficiency. And they're marketing it like a Star Trek-like society is coming, isn't it? Wonderful, right? But behind all that, everything that they're actually saying is actually in line. Like it's been reworded in some research, but research Agenda 21. And now it's Agenda 2030, which was a long-range plan put to basically change the nature of society, where that they want large tracts of land. People remove large tracts of land. They say it's to actually so the land can recover environmentally. I'll come back to that in a minute because I actually found something what they're actually going to do. Humanity at large will be herded into these cities, which will be high tech. right? And okay, it sounds okay. They're openly marketing this like you will have no property. They're gonna phase out the idea of property. You won't own anything. You will have no privacy. Well, we have no privacy now, but we think we do, right? And they said you'll never be happier, right? The idea of a food shortage and an economic crash and even the energy contraction has all been modeled years ago. They knew this particular situation was coming. In fact, a lot of my work shows it was quite easily shown that at some point that this would happen, and it was even like within a narrow bandwidth of say 10, 15 years, right? And so they knew this was going to happen, right? So now you're in a situation where hyper surveillance is happening, to the point of police state and all the negative connotations of that. We've now got poverty, food shortages are on the horizon and closing fast, right? And now we've got an energy contraction as well, right? So that system they're talking about is to actually manage a very difficult and problematic set of food shortages. We all must go without and pull together and right. So you've got this thing where to manage a future that has a lot of difficulties to it. Now, saying before, the whole idea of a cashless society is people will have no choice. Their money comes from an employer, okay, but it's put into a bank, and that bank will then be subject to regulation. For example, Goldman Sachs. I just tried to find the article. I can't find it, but recently it appeared on Blacklisted News. But Goldman Sachs actually said that they've got a new system of granting credit, loans, that will look at your search history on the web, right? And if you've actually looked at websites that their fact checkers deem as problematic, you won't be given a loan. That's the Chinese Sesame credit system being rolled out, but under different. And again, you're kidding, right? So yeah, so we've got the idea of the Great Reset, where people at the top of the food chain want to stay at the top of the food chain. They've already got so much money. It's all about how do they maintain their position of power, right? So they know this difficult window is coming. How do they manage things where the great unwashed masses don't turn on them and they still have their position of power on the other side of this crisis or in the next stable phase, whatever that is? And this was their idea, right? And so we've been talking to, and there are things like all the like when September 11 happened, the Twin Tower attacks. They go, oh, okay. Two things happened. First, a whole series of unethical resource wars kicked off. A lot of them based around energy, right? But how do you convince a democracy to engage in unethical resource wars without using the words peak oil? Right, here we go.
Hermann Goering told us this.
Yeah. Yeah, so good old Herman, right? Then the second thing that happened was the start of the police state kicked off, the surveillance state and all the legal laws that are associated with that. And it started out saying we are trying to track foreign terrorists from a particular part of the world, and that part of the world is largely defenseless because they don't have the same technological or economic clout because how things have worked out over time. So they've got no choice but to wear this label that's been applied to them, and we'll just go along with it. Yeah, righto. But very quickly, we forgot about the foreign terrorists, and the domestic terrorists became the focus. So people like you and me now became the focus. Right, and so the implication is we are going to become the problem, right? And so all the surveillance state has now been put together. Now, when we get
go to waste,
hey,
it'd be a shame to let all that surveillance state go to waste.
Yeah, well, it's taken such a long time to put together. I don't think for a moment it's taken such a long time to put together that and a lot of effort. It takes years of planning. It's not just like a knee-jerk reaction at all. So all of this sort of stuff that's actually we've been coming here has taken a long time to put together. Research Agenda 21, which is now Agenda 2030, and then reference that against what the Great Reset is now suggesting. And when they said we're going to reset capitalism, so okay. So the idea of capitalism is based on growth. And once we enter into a contracting energy system, it's going to be very difficult from a biology point of view. For example, the complexity of a system is defined by the energy that's put into it, its size and its complexity. You remove some of the energy, the system has to get smaller and less complex. That's just the way it is in terms of biology networks. Right. Human society and industrial networks are the same. Right. So if we cannot solve the energy problem, where oil's the most calorically dense energy source, and all the new electrical systems like electric vehicles and what have you don't have a high enough energy return on energy invested system to outperform oil. Right. It's going to be very expensive and very costly, and a lot of the infrastructure required for it just hasn't been made yet. And in fact, the information I'm pulling together is showing that we probably won't even have the minerals to do it when the time comes. Right. So it's going to be very easy just to dismiss all that. Right. So if we don't solve the energy problem, then we're now in a contracting system. How does, for example, a corporation survive where instead of a corporation's got to survive on something like 5 to 10% profit each year?
Mm-hmm.
And it's something like that. It was 10%. I don't know what it is now. But how does a corporation survive when it can't do that and it shows a net loss each year? Especially when they're dependent on creditors and debtors and investors who all want their money to grow, not shrink.
It doesn't, is the answer.
Right. So we are grading into a system that we haven't seen before. And in fact, James Howard Kunstler wrote the book, The Long Emergency. That's kind of how I see things at the moment. It's going to be one damn thing after another until the system stabilizes into whatever the new system is. Right. And so there's going to be winners and grinners. And how do we put ourselves in how does the people who are organizing the Great Reset how do we put themselves in a situation where they are still at the top of the food chain, they're still respected as the authority, and they still have the power, and everyone else knows their place. So, right. So,
yeah, that's the big problem. And I tell you what, I saw a post from a mate of mine out of the UK. Quick shout out to Lyndon. You know who you are, mate. And he said something, and he was absolutely right. Because people keep asking, what can I do against this Great Reset? And by the way, everybody, I realize we've covered off on a whole bunch of stuff, and we're going to come back and we're going to dive deeper into each area and expand on a whole bunch of stuff and new areas we haven't covered today. But people say, hey, how can we combat this Great Reset? Because a lot of people are starting to hear about it. And it's like, well, what do you do? It just sounds so fatal and so fatalistic and whatever. There's just nothing you can do as an ordinary person. And the advice Lyndon had, and he's right, is not simply bank money, but start gaining or gathering assets. Because part of the Great Reset is forgiveness of personal debt for the renunciation of personal assets. And I actually personally believe that's going to come to a sovereign level as well, forgiveness of sovereign debt for the renunciation of sovereign assets as a final one of the later phases. But how can you Sun Tzu says that the greatest way to win a battle or win a war is to attack strategy. That's the first level of winning a war, is attack strategy. If you want to attack strategy, you have to, one of the key strategies here is you'll own nothing, but you'll be happier. Well, screw you, I'm going to own everything I can. What happens when the majority of the public go out and start owning stuff outright, not leveraged? In other words, no mortgage, no whatever, but they start investing in stuff they can own outright. What's your take on that?
See, I don't know how the legality of take a look at how the Chinese system operates. That's probably they've openly discussed that that's a good model to emulate.
Yes, they have.
Right. So if you happen to own assets that are valuable, right? How do you keep them? How do you legally keep
Yeah.
them? If you the most important thing for me is actually not assets. It's actually what's inside between your ears and in your heart and in your hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
So become flexible. Understand that the world is changing. Don't be too attached to any of the old structures. You know, people will defend the old way of thinking bitterly to the bitter end.
Yeah, forget that.
Be flexible and understand that the world is changing, right? And develop the ability to learn and problem solve in a new environment, right? That's perhaps the best way forward. If you happen to have assets at the moment, lots of money, get them out of the stock market for a start. Get them out of treasury bills or anything like that, and convert them to assets that again you own outright, and then shift all debt. Get out of the debt profile. You're better off having a small asset pie that is not debt related at all.
Yep.
And you're better off having one small house that you own outright than 5 houses that you mostly own. Like if you, for example, have a mortgage where you've paid off, you've only got like 10 or 15% of the mortgage left to pay. That's still too much. That's still enough for them to actually sort of. They won't come after you first, but what happened in the Great Depression was for banks themselves to survive, because the banks had to go through an evolution as well. Is they would say things like the value of your property has now dropped by blah 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 blah. And they did this in 2008 too. And you'd get like a letter in the mail that says your value of your house has dropped by $50,000. You will now pay $25,000 in the next 10 days, or we're just going to recoup your house.
Yeah, because under Basel, the banks created their own protocols.
It's in the fine print of what you signed.
And this is the crazy thing: the self-regulation of the banks under Basel was initially Basel II, then Basel III. 80% maximum loan to debt, and anything less, you're absolutely right. They reduce them. That's exactly what happened in 2008, and it can happen again. So no leverage. Do not have anything leveraged. And like I think you're saying as well, and you're absolutely right. There is the more portable the asset, so gold bars, silver, whatever. The more portable the asset, be it a business, because it could be a portable business as well. But the more portable the asset, the easier it'll be to combat this. Because one of the things I'm concerned about is this: even if you own your house outright, let's take my parents or anyone's parents, right? They own their house outright, or I own my house outright. When it comes, when my day comes to pass, and I kick the bucket, and I want to pass it on, even if I have the cleverest structure, the same as the the Rockefellers, whoever else, I guarantee you that they will find a way to tax that to such an extent that the beneficiaries of your asset, your house, will be lumbered with so much tax they'll have no choice but to sell it back to the state or whoever the organization is, and you will own it. So you may get to live in your house, for as long as you're alive, but your offspring and your grandchildren definitely won't get the benefit from it.
The mood's going to change, and I can see a situation where governments lose their tax-based revenue, and they'll be in survival mode too. And anyone or anything in survival mode tends to turn nasty, right? And so they'll do things that you just shake your head and say, "How is this allowed? How is this even possible?" And that's why you often sort of see like organizations like Centrelink at the moment, and on Social Security, they've run out of money. Right, which is why you see them sort of behaving in a way, interacting in a way with the people who actually sort of need the help at all. It's very difficult to do business with them, and it's very sort of it's quite upsetting, and that's why. And so the other problem is gold and silver. Let's say you had gold and silver. There's no guarantees you can exchange it for anything valuable in an environment like that, or in a system that's coming. So there is no easy answers here. There is no sort of easy, smoking gun answers. That's why I say is learn to develop flexibility, learn and problem solve in a shifting environment where the rules around you are going to change.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps the best defense. And if you're rich now, there's no guarantees you're going to stay rich. And that's right. And if you're poor now, the future says, oh, you're going to be poor again. But what if the rules changed? And if you thought differently and you're poor now, but in the new system that's coming because you did things differently, you're not poor anymore in the new system.
Mm.
Right? Because the system they want to bring in, the great... Say again?
I reckon a lot of people who are, breadline sort of situation with the right mindset going forward, and that is not. I'm not saying have a mindset of I'll bow down and accept everything.
No. Yeah,
not. But with the right mindset, those who have nothing right now could actually benefit from what's about to come, because those who have a whole bunch of stuff a lot of them I talk to don't see this coming. They can't see it happening.
Yeah, so I see what we call the Great Reset. They're going to roll it out, and I don't think it's going to work. It's not going to go to plan, and we're going to see some creative destruction of that system. And you've got the underlying limitations of energy contraction as well. But in that environment, a new system's going to form, and a new kind of thinking is going to take hold, and that will flourish. Now, what that is, we won't know till we get there. But the Great Reset is the plan, and it's coming. But I don't think it's going to work, because everything else they've been that group of people has tried to do since 2008 has not worked. So it'll roll out. It'll be messy, but it's going to fall apart on them. What happens next? That's when that new kind of thinking will then create the new world.
And if you're wondering where Simon said that group since 2008, if you're wondering who that group is and what they've been doing, we'll come back to that in the next episode. There's the teaser to come on back and listen again. There's so much for us to cover here, mate. We can't do it justice in one episode in 1 hour. This is going to take us coming back again. There's so many things we haven't even brought back together, but I hope what people are getting from this is a little bit better than a broad understanding of what's about to happen, and a little bit better than a broad understanding of why it's happened. And I know you have so much knowledge in this area, and although I have a degree of knowledge, compared to you, I'm playing catch up. So thank you for everything you do there.
It's strange to hear you say that. I suppose I've just been charging off like a freight train after several topics, and this is all the stuff that's happened along the way. I haven't really sort of thought about, how it compared to, say, everyone else.
No, mate. Listen, I think most people are going to be like, holy. I think the most people are getting a wake up call from this. A lot of people will have heard some of it. The greater majority of it will put together not. But there's a whole lot more. There is a whole lot more to come. We are going to come back and we're going to talk more about how money came about and the intricacies of how influence happens, how influence and power happens as a result of where money flows to and from, because there's so much to be discussed there. And I know you know about that. We're going to talk about in relation to the energy resources in the world and the different markets and the indices that have been occurring over the recent times, and how these have been markers for what's about to come and what has happened, which just go unnoticed by the general population. We're going to look at patterns. A lot of people say, oh, human life is not, there is no pattern to life. Chaos theory has no pattern. But actually, if you look at chaos theory and you look at the study of chaos theory, there is a pattern. You just have to stand far enough back to be able to see it. And I know that we're going to cover off on that. Maybe will you be happy to come back, let's say next week, and
Sure.
And what we'll do is we'll probably broadcast out to everybody what we're going to think, the things we're going to talk about first. If anyone has stuff they want us to talk about, we'll go deeper into off this, please let us know, and we will, because there's a lot to be covered. We're going to do our best to keep it global and zero in on different countries, but we're going to do our best to keep it global, because this is a global problem. And
yes. The work I'm doing at the moment, I'm doing a series of simulations of what it would take to phase out fossil fuels. That's the work I'm doing at the moment. And you do a global system first, and then a European system second, a United States system third, and a Chinese system fourth. Right, and that's how it's structured, and that's how you got to look at this. You look at the global system first, then the major players.
Right. And so little people like Australia just don't even factor in.
We're too small.
Yeah,
no, seriously, we're too small. How many of the computers that you operate, or the electronic stuff that's in your home, that was manufactured in Australia?
Yeah, none. But
yeah, right. So we're in a system where everyone's dependent on everyone else, and the larger markets dictate what happens elsewhere. And what happens in Australia was dictated by the British Isles, then it was dictated by the United States, and now it's dictated by the Chinese.
Yep.
Right? So you're too small.
Yep.
And no, and all the resources you've got on the ground in terms of agriculture and mining, they're not ours anymore. We've given them away. We've sold them.
We have, unfortunately, and we've and this is something else we'll cover off in future episodes in this series. Not only have we given that, and this is not just about Australia. Look in your own country. If you're in a European country or America or one of the Canada or wherever, look at your own country. You'll see the same pattern dating back to mid-70s and beyond that. Not only have we given away our resource, the ownership of our resources, we've given away our industry to exploit those resources. And we've done it in a way which favors those countries which we've then supported to, to build up the new industry. And that was all done. You may not want to know this, you may not want to believe this, but the documentation's out there. This was done by design.
So have a look what the United States system is doing as it phases out, and have a look what the Chinese system is doing as it phases in. And Australia is between those two goalposts.
Yep, absolutely. And then just a document we will come back to, Lima Declaration 1975. I'll leave that one there for you to look up before we go into it, because that and a number of other international agreements establish some really interesting basis for discussions about why we are where we are. Mate, awesome. Thank you so much. What if we can leave people on an upbeat note, what is it we can say to people to give them some degree? I always say hope is a poor man's gambling addiction. So let's not leave them with hope. Let's leave them with something concrete that they can think about of what you've already said.
Everyone should try thinking for themselves at least once. Now would be a good time.
Perfect. Couldn't agree more. All right. Thank you, Simon. Thanks so much for being here, mate. We're going to be back here next week, everybody. Leave comments wherever you're seeing this. Thank you very much for watching, and especially so long. These episodes could be a lot longer. We're trying to keep them as short as we can so that we can make them consumable. Look forward to seeing you again next week. Same place, same time. And in the meantime, get out and get educated on what's happening now, and start, like Simon said, start thinking for yourself at least once. Have a great day.
See you guys.